last talk is Rebecca Nelson. Rebecca is the student member of the Northern California Botanists. So she's also a PhD candidate at UC Davis in the Harrison and Valdovinos labs. And she has her bachelor's from Stanford and her master's from UC Davis, both in ecology. Please welcome Rebecca, who will be talking about restoring plant pollinator mutualisms in serpentine grasslands.
Thank you for the introduction, and to Northern California botanists for putting on this wonderful symposium and inviting me to speak today. Before I dive into talking about my research, I just want to give a few brief acknowledgments. The land in which the study that I'm going to be talking about today took place on is Patwin and Miwok ancestral lands, and I'd like to thank my primary advisor, Susan Harrison, as well as my co-advisor for my PhD, Fernanda Valdovinos, for all their support, and also acknowledge the co-authors on this project, Fernanda Valdovinos, Paul Aigner, and Sabine Dritz, and thank you to Paul Aigner and Kathy Kohler at the McLaughlin Reserve for all of their support. Yeah, so we think of serpentine grasslands around this idea of a refugia, in that serpentine grasslands have high biodiversity. They have very nutrient-deficient soil that often contains a lot of heavy metals, so that often prevents most invasive plants from growing on them. So we often tell the story of them being this refuge and this sort of sanctuary for a lot of plant diversity in California, as well as for pollinator diversity associated with a lot of those wildflowers. However, the serpentine can be vulnerable to the ways in which people impact the environment. One particularly problematic invader for serpentine is an annual grass called barbed goatgrass that in its native range in Eurasia can naturally grow on serpentine soils, which is something that most grasses tend to struggle with that are invasive species in California. But this grass, Aigner triancialis, does quite well on serpentine, and unfortunately is forming these really dense monocultures where it's outcompeting a lot of the native wildflowers that we get in serpentine grasslands. So the research that I'll be sharing today is one chapter from my dissertation work, and ultimately what it's asking is, how does removing this invasive goatgrass as a restoration practice affect serpentine plant-pollinator interactions? So before I dive into how we approach this question, I just kind of want to walk you through my hypotheses for this study. So if we remove the goatgrass via restoration, I was predicting that this would sort of have two major impacts on the grassland. One would be that wildflower diversity and cover would increase, since these wildflowers are mostly being outcompeted by this invasive grass species. And then I further predicted that patches of bare ground would also increase as you get rid of grass cover. And both of these things can be potentially very beneficial for pollinators, both in increasing the diversity and the abundance of floral resources, as well as opening up more patches of habitat for ground nesting bees. So this could potentially increase pollinator diversity and abundance and stabilize the overall web of plant-pollinator interactions within a given meadow. So to test these hypotheses, I collaborated with Paul Aigner at the University of California McLaughlin Reserve, which is way up in the inner north coast range of California, kind of where Clear Lake and Lower Lake, California are. And Paul and Kathy, as part of their ongoing land management efforts, back in 2011, did an experiment where they selectively removed barbed goatgrass from certain serpentine areas within the McLaughlin Reserve. So they used a mix of mowing, hand pulling, and grass-specific herbicides to get rid of the goatgrass. But then in some places within the same meadow, they also left some control plots where they still had the goatgrass. And then Paul and his team of interns from 2011 to 2013 collected 3 years of pollinator observations as well as plant community data on what happened as a result of these restoration practices. And this data set kind of sat in a corner for about 10 years or so, and then when I started grad school, I had the fortunate opportunity to connect with Paul and kind of provide a more statistical lens in which to analyze the data and collaborate. And here we can kind of see what this meadow looked like circa 2011 when they began this restoration effort. So all of these plots were sort of concentrated within a specific meadow. So what I was really looking at here is sort of like locally within a given serpentine meadow, we were looking at where are pollinators preferring to forage versus more broader landscape scale changes in response to restoration. Yeah, so I'm going to show a few results about plants, pollinators, and the overall network of plant-pollinator interactions. So what these are here is how the plant community responded. So in panel A, we fortunately see that in the restored plots where the goat grass was removed, there's significantly lower goat grass cover than the controls where it was left in place. So that's good news to see because it means that all of the amazing restoration efforts were successful in getting rid of the goat grass. And it also had the additional consequence that we see in panel B of also just generally reducing grass cover significantly for all annual grass species present within the meadow, not just the goat grass, though most of the other exotic grass species were in very low amounts since they didn't really do well on serpentine. In panel C, we see how the cover of Listeria californica, or goldfield flowers, respond to restoration. So the goldfields, which were our most abundant wildflower species at this site, significantly increased in their cover. If we look at, in panel D, wildflowers as a whole, so all of the wildflowers at our site that were visited by pollinators in our data, we found that removing the goat grass significantly increased wildflower cover compared to the control plots. So the takeaway from that is if you get rid of the goat grass for restoration, you get more diversity and more abundance of flowers. So now let's see if the pollinators sort of track this shift in the plant community. And we find that they do. So we found that the richness in terms of species diversity of pollinators was significantly higher in these restored plots relative to ones where the goat grass was still left in place. And we also had a significantly higher abundance of pollinator visits on plants as well. In addition, we looked at Shannon diversity, which is a measure of evenness. So that kind of tells us, do we have an even spread of pollinator species in our community, or are we mostly having one more dominant species? And we find that the overall evenness of pollinators also increases in response to restoration. We then specifically subsetted out which of our bee species in our data are ground nesters, and we found that ground nesting bee abundance also significantly increased. So pollinators are likely responding to increased diversity and abundance of wildflower resources, but also potentially an increase in patches of bare ground being opened up by the removal of the invasive grass. So now I'm going to walk you through sort of plant pollinator networks for these sites. So in order to construct a plant pollinator network, what we did was look at an entire web of all of the interactions of plants and pollinators within the meadow. So to sort of walk you through it, if you've never encountered a network graph before, all of the top little boxes each represent a unique pollinator species that we surveyed, in this case within the control plots. And all of the bottom rectangles represent unique plant species that we surveyed, and the lines between them are plant-pollinator interactions. And the thicker the box or the line, the more frequently we observe that given interaction or species within a network. So the yellow box is the most frequently observed plant species, and that is Listeria californica. So our most abundant plant species also turned out to be the plant species that was most frequently visited by pollinators within our network. So it acted as sort of this key hub for pollinators. The red box is our invasive goat grass, which pollinators did land on the floral structure of the invasive goat grass, so we recorded it as a visit. But biologically speaking, those pollinators probably didn't get much benefit from visiting the grass. It's a wind-pollinated grass. It doesn't really produce nutritional floral resources in the same way that some of the wildflowers like Listenia do. So now let's compare this to our restored network and see what we found. So just kind of glancing at these two side by side, we see that again in the restored network, we have the goldfields as this really key, most frequently visited plant species that acts as a hub for the rest of the network. We no longer, fortunately, see any goat grass in our network, and we see a lot more lines connecting all of the different species together. So what does that mean? That means that besides having more plant diversity and more pollinator diversity, we're also just seeing a greater diversity of plant-pollinator interactions within our network. So if we look at the network properties, this means that there is significantly more overlap in niches between pollinators. So that may suggest that this network might be more stable and having more redundancy of pollinators within a similar functional role. We then looked further at what exactly do these goldfields as this really important generalist hub for pollinators do within our network. So they're most abundant wildflower, they're this key hub. But if we also calculate a network metric called nestedness, which is just kind of a jargony term for like a species that interacts with both generalists and specialists, means that like a network is particularly nested because the interactions are kind of layered within each other. So what that means is that this goldfield really contributed to the nestedness of the network, having a stabilizing effect on the network structure. So it's helping stabilize by acting as its critical hub for pollinators. And the stabilizing influence that the goldfields had significantly increased when we compared our restored network to our control one. So these goldfields are playing a really key role in this system. So our key takeaway here is that removing the goat grass as a restoration practice successfully restored plant-pollinator mutualisms and kind of speaks to the importance of like thinking about beyond restoring given species to restoring whole communities and moving beyond restoring communities to restoring functional interactions such as plant-pollinator mutualisms within our grasslands and meadows. So I kind of want to jump forward to the present day and highlight what the same site now looks like 10 years after these initial restoration treatments were applied, and wrap up by sharing a couple of key lessons learned from a management standpoint. So first, the reason that we see all of these beautiful goldfields as well as more species starting to come back like these amazing Clarkia are that Kathy and Paul and their team of interns go out every spring and continue to remove the goat grass. So it requires continuous care in order to continue to maintain these restored serpentine meadows and over time start to really decrease the amount of goat grass that is present in the seed bank. Another key takeaway from the network element of the study is that two different things are really important for restoring pollinators. One is having a diversity of plants really increase the diversity of pollinators. So sort of echoing back to Justin's talk, really restoring and aiming to kind of bring back a greater diversity of flowers at a site. And the other key takeaway is that even if you can only restore one focal species, it can still really make a positive impact on your meadow. Like for instance, with these goldfields, all of the different functional groups of pollinators we had in our study visited them. They were very diverse in terms of species richness, and they played a really key stabilizing role in the network. So even if you're only able to concentrate your restoration efforts on a really abundant generalist wildflower species like California goldfields, you can have a lot of success in diversifying your community of pollinators within your grassland. So I hope that this is kind of a positive success story for how grassland restoration can really transform the landscape in ways that benefits plants, pollinators, and people. Thank you so much for your time, and if you'd like to learn more about what I'm working on, you can check out my website. I also have a preprint of this study available. It hasn't been finalized yet in terms of being published, but you can check out the preprint, or feel free to email me. Like if you're thinking of monitoring pollinators or are, I'm always happy to chat about plant-pollinator interactions and collaborations between land managers and academics. Thank you. I see we have some time for questions. Does anyone have any follow-up questions? Yeah, I think I see a hand up over here.
Hi,
Yeah.
Rebecca. Over here.
Or yeah, whoever wants to go first.
What was the method for removing the invasive grass? And
Yeah.
did you have to reseed the plants after the removal, or did they naturally, through succession, come back, the native plant species?
Yeah, those are fantastic questions. Thank you. So to answer your first question, we used a mixture of mowing the invasive grass, hand pulling it, and also applying 2 grass-specific herbicides, fusilade and clethodim, to them. And one thing I didn't have a chance to touch on in my talk is that we compared whether there were differences between these different removal methods on the pollinators, and found that all of the treatments were equally effective in getting rid of the goat grass and increasing the plant and pollinator diversity. So we did look at the mowing. And then to answer your second question, we did not seed any plants into this system. So all of the recovery of the plants was just from the natural serpentine seed bank. A lot of these species were still present in the seed bank, but unfortunately with the goat grass just being really dominant in the seed bank, they were getting outcompeted. So it was really kind of tilting the balance of power in the seed bank to have less goat grass and more of these native serpentine plants to just naturally rebound. Thank you. Yeah, was there another question?
So she asked a big part of my question, which is great. So I was wondering which herbicide specifics you use, pre-emergent or grass-specific, but you answered that. And I'm wondering the timing of the treatments. Did you have a certain timeline that was strict that you stuck to, mowing and then herbicide within a certain window of time, or what kind of did you do for that?
Yeah, that's a great question. Thank you. Yeah, so as part of the original study that this follow-up study was based off of, we did vary the timing in terms of in the spring versus fall. There were some sort of variations in comparing spring versus fall application of the herbicides, as well as like experimenting with the timing of mowing. And there's this wonderful paper by Paul Aigner and Rhett Rulery in Applied Vegetative Management Journal from 2011 that really provides a super in-depth breakdown of like all of the different timing of the treatments and what they found in terms of the effectiveness. So if you're interested, I can send you that paper because I think it does a really great job of going like more in depth into diving into that. Thank you. Yeah, do we have time for any remaining questions? Yeah. I don't know if you have a microphone.
Oh, I was just going to ask a real
Yeah,
quick
go
question.
for it.
So on your graph, looking at the wildflowers and the floral visitors, the measure furthest to the left was the largest, but I also noticed that it didn't seem to correlate with other species. I was just curious what group of floral visitors that was. Was it Bombus or, because it was always directly correlated with Licinia.
Yeah, that's a great question, and I'll, for reference, kind of toggle back to the networks. So, yeah, the groups on the furthest left tended to mostly be solitary andrenid bees. There tended to be a lot of those that really specialized on the Licinia, as well as some smaller flies. But in general, it tended to also get to lesser degrees a wider variety of moths, other types of bees. The bombus were in the network, but tended to more visit things like Trifolium fucatum or bull clover that had a little bit of a bigger flower structure with like a deeper corolla. Yeah, that's a really interesting question. Thank you. And then I think we have time for one more question. Yeah, over here.
Thank you. For the treatment to like remove goat grass, is that something you think you're gonna just have to do forever?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think it is something that to like a large degree that the McLaughlin Reserve will have to keep doing. And I think it kind of ties into just sort of the way we approach restoration, that if we do have the time and the funding and the capacity, I think being able to sort of think about restoration as this long-term process that's ongoing, that kind of requires this like sustained relationship and deep care for the land is something that I think is really important, especially for this system where potentially if you stop managing it, the goat grass might come back again. Thank you.